name is Kay Byfield, and this is your ArtSpeaks Studio Moment from ArtSpeaks Studio in Dallas, Texas. And today I want to explain why watercolor paper matters so much. Most watercolor painters will tell you that the paper is the critical part of doing a good painting. So let's talk about different watercolor papers. The paper that a book is made out of and the paper that your newspaper is made out of is typically wood pulp. And wood pulp is a different kind of fiber than linen papers and cotton papers that bind together better. They're made out of ground up cotton fibers who are in an emulsion, and then they are laid as a paper. And the paper that is wood pulp doesn't absorb the paint the same way. It tends to not be able to take the paint. The paint tends to sit on the surface, and it's very hard to get the depth of color and value that you want. And so I thought I would show you what I mean. Okay, so I'm going to run several experiments with the paper using the different papers just so you can see how the different papers handle the paint. And the first experiment I'm going to do is running a graded wash that changes from one color to another. And this particular, for no reason, I'm going to use a very, very bright pink. And I'm changing it to a purple, and then I'm changing that purple to a blue to see how the paint moves on the paper. The next thing I'm going to do is take this pear shape that I came up with out of my head, and I'm going to try to make it look like it has some form, it has some volume. It's a little bit three-dimensional. And I want to see how the paint is handled on all the different surfaces, all the different papers, when I try to do something like this, which is something that most painters do with their paintings. And I'm starting with the Arches 140-pound cold press, because that's the paper that I use most typically, and I am trying to see everything will be compared to this. So my yellow pear has some green in it, and it has a little bit of red in it. And now I've got to get some darker color in here so that I can have some shadow. The light's going to come from this side, so I'm going to take my yellow and add a little bit of violet to it to neutralize it a little, to dull it. And that's going to be my shadow. Move back out a little bit. Lift some paint that is pooling down here and will be running back if I'm not careful. Put a little bit more yellow back in. And I'm going to call that finished. The third experiment I want to do is I'm going to try to do a graded wash with ultramarine blue so that it's darker at the top. You'll notice all of these were painted on an inclined surface. It's darker at the top and gets lighter as it goes down. So what I did is I wet my rectangle. I start at the top with more paint. And then as I go down the rectangle, I add more water and less paint. And I let the paint paint itself as much as I can so that it's noticeably lighter at the bottom than it is at the top. Okay, so let's compare all the other papers to what I did with the Arches paper. I tried as much as I could to do it exactly the same way on all the papers. So here we have the Canson on my left and the Arches on my right. And here's the graded colors strip that I did with the pink to the purple to the blue in the Arches and the pink to the purple and the blue in the Canson. And what I notice is that the pink seems to be much brighter in the Arches. They both handle the paint pretty much the same. It feels different when you're painting it, but they handle the paint pretty much the same in the pink and the purple. But when you get down to the ultramarine blue at the bottom, the Canson granulates quite a lot, the blue, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it isn't what I was going for. And it's a lot smoother. It does granulate a little bit in the Arches, but not to the same extent. When we look at the two pairs, there's a huge difference. The Arches paper handled that pair. Remember, I could, if I wanted this to get even darker shadows, I could go back again once it's dry and add more dark, but I didn't want to do this. I wanted to do it in one pass to see what would happen. It was impossible to get any darks really in the Canson paper. And when we look at the two graded washes, the Canson paper, again, it's ultramarine blue. The Canson paper gave me a fairly decent grade, but it's a bit streaky and it has a lot of granulation in it. Whereas my Arches paper is nice and smooth, and except for down here where some of the water pooled and so it ran back a little bit, which is my fault, not the paper's. It's a nice, smooth, graded wash. This is the Strathmore paper, which is also 100% wood pulp. And the gradations are terrible on the Strathmore. The color is brighter on the Arches. It may not show that way on the camera, but it definitely is to the naked eye. And the Strathmore paper, the paint didn't move on its own. Remember, it was on an incline, and on the Arches, it painted itself. On the Strathmore, it stayed right where I applied it and didn't move at all. So I get these very solid strips. When we come to the pear, I had a really hard time getting the darks into the pear. The paper, it just kept lifting up. Every time I would go back over it, I would have to go back and reinforce it again. I felt like I was fighting the paper. And look what happened with the gradation. It's just totally streaky on the Strathmore, whereas I got that nice smooth gradation on the Arches, which is 100% cotton. And here's the Fabriano Studio, which my student accidentally purchased. And I don't like the texture on it. It's very regular and predictable. You can see it really clearly here with the naked eye. I don't think the camera is picking it up as much as I wish it would. It was a real struggle to paint on. The paint lifted back up. There was some water that got left here and did a run back that I would never have had happen if I'd been on good paper. And when it came time to do the gradation, it's terribly streaky. You can see all of the texture in the paper, not smooth at all. And this is the Fabriano Artistico, which is 100% rag, 100% cotton paper, as the Arches is. It's also acid-free. It's a nice paper. I don't like their cold press for myself. It's a personal style issue. I don't like their cold press as well as I like the Arches cold press, but I like their hot press, their smooth paper, for some things that I try to do very much. It's a little softer paper. And you can see that when I did the gradation with the pink to the purple to the blue, it didn't flow one into the other in the same way that the arches did, but the color is nice and bright. In fact, it looks a little bit brighter than the color in the arches. When I did the pears, I had a lot more trouble with the Fabriano trying to get those darks in there, but not to the same extent as what I had with the wood pulp papers. So it's not nearly as satisfying as the arches was in that regard. When I went to do the gradation, it did a nice gradation, not as smooth as the arches. I am seeing a little bit of granulation in it, but it's satisfactory and I could live with that. One of the big differences between the rag papers, the cotton papers, and the wood pulp papers, however, is how resilient they are, how durable they are. And one of the best parts of the arches paper, and the reason why I recommend it to students, is because it lifts so well. You can scrub on it, you can lift color back off, even if the colors are what we're calling staining colors. So if I put some alizarin crimson right here, which is a staining color, and let it dry, I'll show you how it lifts. Okay, if I just take a brush with a little bit of water on it and I wipe it across the surface, you can see that a lot of the color comes right back up. Now I'm not back to white, this is a staining color, but I get pretty light. And if I use a scrubby, which is just hard bristle brush that's intended to lift, I can really scrub it off, but yet my paper is still quite there. If I want to lift a bigger shape, I use what I call kind of a template here that I've cut out, and I'm going to, this is ultramarine blue, and I'm going to lift it with a, natural sponge, and I'm just going to scrub off that heart shape, and it lifts out quite nicely. And when those are dry, I can paint right back over them. So I can go right back in, and I'm painting with alizarin crimson. And you can see that I'm getting a very nice color and that the quality of the paint looks really good. What I was trying to do with this last experiment was lifting and scrubbing to see what the paper would do when you actually had to lift up something, because we all need to make corrections and lift back out of shapes sometimes and fix them. When I did the arches, I got a nice little lift when I just put water on it and I lifted it. And then I went back and put yellow paint over it to see what would happen to the paint underneath. Now remember, the rule is you never paint over a darker color with a lighter one, because the darker color will bleed into the lighter color. But I wanted to see if I could maintain that yellow pretty well, or whether I was going to lift up all that red right into the yellow. And I'm really pleased that you can still see the yellow, you can see that red shape pretty well, and the yellow looks yellow down below after I've gone across the red. And when I painted the heart, which had been scrubbed off with that template, the heart template, I got a nice, smooth, rich color red heart. Okay, so let's see what happens when we put the yellow over the lift on the little red here. Notice I couldn't get a clean lift. And when I put the yellow across it, I'm dragging a lot of that red into my yellow. And I didn't scrub across it. I wasn't trying to do that, but it's sitting on the surface so much that it lifts quite readily. When I painted my heart, the color is not as intense, and I tried to do it exactly the same. I got a pretty good shape, and the lift was pretty clean. So it's not as bad as it might be, and it's certainly not as bad as the Strathmore. So here's the Strathmore. When I lifted the heart shape, I got all of the residue of the paper coming up in nubbies onto the paper. And when I painted back into it, you can see with the naked eye, I don't know if the camera will show it, but you can see all that texture where all of that residue of the paper pulp is sitting in there. It's like pills on a sweater. With the red, I was unable to lift back to nearly as white. And when I take the yellow and go across it, it's bleeding a bit, but not too badly. So I would never recommend the Strathmore because you can't lift into it and get anything that's nice and clean. With the Fabriano Studio, which is 25% cotton and 75% wood pulp, I didn't get a clean lift. When I go across it with yellow, I'm dragging a lot of red. A lot of red comes right off, and it continues to do that. When I tried to lift the heart out, I got very, very fuzzy edges. I couldn't get a clean shape as I could in the arches. And the color in the heart itself isn't nearly as bright as the color of the heart. Remember, the heart was blue. Then I lifted the blue off and I still had some residual blue, but this looks like a red heart. And with the Fabriano Artistico, which like the arches is 100% cotton and acid-free, when I go over it with the yellow, I'm lifting quite a lot of the red. I wasn't able to get as clean a shapes as I did with the arches. But when I painted the heart, it's a nice smooth shape. So it handles a little better. Remember that with the pear, I couldn't get the darks the way that I could with the arches. The problem, of course, is that all of this is very confusing. And how do you know if you're using good paper? Look for it to say not only that it's 100% acid-free, but that it's 100% cotton. And you want something that you can paint on. It will stand up to the kinds of abuse of brushing across the paper a lot and laying subsequent glazes and lifting and scrubbing, or it's not going to do you any good. And you want those darks and those bright colors. So I recommend that you look for a paper that has a watermark. That's the sign that it's a quality paper. And if in doubt, get on the internet and find out what the paper's made of. Don't look at the advertisers saying this is good for professionals and students alike. Look for a paper that you know you're paying for quality. It's a little bit more expensive, but gosh, it pays off in the long run. I hope this information is useful to you, and until next time, I wish you happy painting. Bye.